Our next keynote presentation is by Saru Jayaraman. And Saru is the president of One Fair Wage and director of the Food Labor Research Center at University of California, Berkeley. Saru is a graduate of Yale Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. After 9/11, together with displaced World Trade Center workers, she co-founded the Restaurant Opportunity Center, or the ROC, which grew into a national movement of restaurant workers, employers, and consumers. She then launched One Fair Wage as a national campaign to end all sub-minimum wages in the United States. The story of Saru and her co-founders' work founding ROC has been chronicled in the book, The Accidental American. And the story of the One Fair Wage campaign has been profiled in the new film, Waging Change. She's received many, many awards. She's been named one of Crane's 40 Under 40. She's been a recipient of 1010 Wins Newsmaker of the Year and New York Magazine's Influentials of New York City. She was listed in CNN's top 10 visionary women and recognized as a champion of change by the White House in 2014. Saru is also the author of 4 books, including her latest, One Fair Wage, Ending All Sub-Minimum Pay in America. So please help me welcome acclaimed speaker, advocate, and author, Saru.
Hello, how's everybody doing this morning? Good. I don't come from your field, so I'm not going to speak the way you're going to hear other people speak throughout your conference. And I think that's probably a good thing because it's really important for you to know what is happening right now in the world of low-wage workers outside of this conference. It is a moment of historic revolution in this country for low-wage workers right now. And I don't say that lightly. I'm an academic, and in addition to being an organizer and an activist and advocate. So I don't say that lightly. And when I say it's a moment of historic revolt, I'm going to share with you some of the history that relates to why this is a moment of historic revolt. And today is a moment of history for me. My work is on the cover of the New York Times website today, front page. The title is Battle Over Wage Rules for Tipped Workers is Heating Up. And it is heating up. So let me tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing over the last 20 years and the history that relates to the last 160 years in this country. So the restaurant industry is my focus. It's been what I've been working on for the last 20 years. But I think the restaurant industry is the epitome of low-wage work in this country. The relationship between wages, harassment, health issues that you deal with, the idea of total health that is the subject of this conference is epitomized in the restaurant industry because it has been literally the lowest paid industry in the United States for generations dating back to emancipation, and I can explain why. So pre-pandemic, the restaurant industry was one of the largest and fastest growing private sector employers in the United States of America. It was nearly 14 million workers. That was almost 1 in 10 American workers working in restaurants. But it's been the absolute lowest paying employer for generations, dating all the way back to emancipation. So here's the history. Tipping as a practice didn't originate in the United States. It originated in feudal Europe. It was something that aristocrats gave to serfs and vassals, but always on top of a wage. Serfs and vassals in feudal Europe actually got paid by their employer. Tips were an extra or a bonus that was given to them on top of that wage for a job well done. So if you read Old English literature or you watch period pieces, you might see references to tipping. Here's an extra 20 quid, old man, for a job well done. That idea of a tip came to the United States in the 1850s, 1840s, 1850s, when rich Americans traveled to Europe and came back and tried to show off that they knew the rules of Europe. And at first, Americans resoundingly rejected this concept. They actually said, there's a populist movement, anti-tipping movement in the United States from about the 1850s to about 1900. 6 states in the US banned tipping entirely. They said this is undemocratic. It is a vestige of feudalism. And by the way, we believe you should get good service regardless of how much you can afford to tip. And we think employers should pay their workers, not customers. And that populist movement spread to Europe. The labor movement picked it up in Europe with the rallying cry of we are professionals. We are not at the mercy and whim of customers. We deserve a livable wage. This is feudalism, and got rid of tipping in much of Europe for many generations until Americans started bringing it back again. But for a long time, the labor movement really kind of in Europe dug their heels and said, we reject tipping. But in the United States, something happened that made us, the originators, by the way, of that anti-tipping movement, go in the opposite direction. I do want to say around that time, Alexis de Tocqueville came to the US, wrote about American democracy and said, wow, one of the hallmarks of American democracy is there is no tipping. They've rejected this vestige of feudalism. But in 1853, something happened. Waiters in major cities like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Chicago, they were mostly white men. They didn't get tips at the time. They got a wage, and they went on strike. They went on strike as waiters for a higher wage. And in response, in 1853, restaurants who didn't want to pay these guys more started replacing them with first white women, as a way to be able to pay women less, as a way to be able to pay less in general. So servers around 1853 started to become majority female. And then 10 years later, the restaurant industry saw an even better opportunity to reduce wages even further, all the way to zero, which was emancipation. At emancipation, 2 industries actually sought the ability to basically continue slavery, have free Black labor, and say to workers, we'll hire you, we won't pay you, but you'll have the privilege of obtaining white people's tips. The 2 industries were the Pullman Train Company. And if you know anything about the history of Black labor in the United States, or labor, you know that the Pullman Train Company was a luxury train company that was running trains with white people, white customers from the East Coast to the West Coast, early 1900s. And hired tens of thousands of Black men as porters, called them all George as a way to basically diminish their humanity, and tried to say, you won't get a wage from us, you'll live on tips as porters. And if you know the history, A. Philip Randolph formed the first Black union in the United States, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and won the right to an actual wage rather than having to live on tips. The other industry, though, was the restaurant industry. They saw this incredible opportunity post-strike of white men to have wages go to zero, which was to hire Black women. They hired Black women in very large numbers post-emancipation, said, we won't pay you, you'll have the privilege of obtaining white people's tips, and hired literally tens of thousands of Black women for no wage and required them to live on tips. It's important to note that at that moment in US history, the hospitality sector mutated tipping from being an extra or bonus on top of a wage to becoming a replacement for wages, the wage itself. And that idea that tips could be the entirety of a person's income became law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right to the federal minimum wage for the first time, but millions of Black workers were excluded. You must know that farm workers were excluded from that initial minimum wage. Domestic workers were excluded, but actually one of the largest populations that was excluded was tipped workers, who were mostly Black women, who were told you get nothing as long as you get tips. And we went from $0 in 1938 to the current federal minimum wage of $2.13 an hour in the United States of America, not for a tiny sliver of the population. I started my talk telling you this is one of the largest and fastest growing private sector employers in the United States of America, still allowed by the federal government to pay its workers $2.13 an hour. Now, states have gone a little bit higher than that. Maryland, the great state of Maryland, which we're sitting in, is $3.53. But it is outrageous. It is ridiculous. It has been a legacy of slavery and a source of poverty and sexual harassment for an immense workforce of mostly women for generations dating back to emancipation. Today, there are 43 states that persist with this legacy of slavery. Most of them, 4 out of 5 states in the US, have a wage that is $5 or less. And we collectively have allowed this industry to get away with saying we shouldn't have to pay our workers' wages. You, the customers, should pay our workers' wages for us because we shouldn't have to. And that is not a coincidence. I do not know how much you are talking today or this week in your conference about the drivers of the problem, the protagonists of the problem, the failures of worker health and worker wages and low-wage work in America are not an accident. They are not organic. They didn't fall from the sky, or they were not ordained by God. They were created by politics and by very powerful trade lobbies of corporations fighting to maintain the lowest wages possible. In this case, the National Restaurant Association, I will call them the other NRA, that's what we call them. So it's a trade lobby that's been named one of the 10 most powerful trade lobbies in the United States, very powerful in almost every state in the United States. They have been around since 1919, when they were formed with the express intent, in 1919, formed with the express intent of suppressing Black workers' wages, both in the agricultural sector and the restaurant sector, to keep their labor costs low. That was the purpose of the other NRA. They still exist today, and for the last 100 years, since 1919, they've been arguing exactly the same thing. We shouldn't have to pay our workers' wages. You should pay our workers' wages for us. It's what the political director of the NRA says in the article in the New York Times this morning. Same argument for the last 100 years. So let us not make any mistake. I hope you this week are not talking about the problems workers face as if they are natural or organic or ordained or somehow just the way things are. They are not the way things are. They have been created intentionally, and that means they can be solved intentionally when we have the will and the power to stand up to corporate forces that have been pushing problems of worker issues and wages and health for a very long time. So in the restaurant industry, this is not an accident that you've got a very low wage, a ridiculous non-wage, I would argue, a legacy of slavery, a $2 wage. It's not an accident that you've got a very powerful trade lobby, and on the other side, you've got a workforce of literally millions of mostly women, disproportionately women of color, mostly women who work in very casual restaurants and bars, Denny's, IHOP, Olive Garden, Red Lobster, mom and pop restaurants, struggling with literally 3 times the poverty rate of other workers, facing the absolute highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry in the United States because they have to tolerate so much to get those tips. So we have done years of participatory research and government data research on this issue, years and years. And initially, we did about 15,000 surveys of workers across the country and asked them, wide range of questions, including, do you experience sexual harassment on the job? And initially, for many years, workers would say, only 1 in 5 workers in the restaurant industry would say, I've experienced sexual harassment on the job. But in around 2010, 2011, I started to hear from so many women across the country these horrific, graphic stories of being frankly assaulted, raped, being asked to show more cleavage, being asked to go home and change and come back, showing more skin, being asked to not just tolerate harassment, but in fact, go out and encourage it in order to make more money in tips. And I knew something was wrong. So we worked with a group of researchers and did a special survey just on this around 2013, 2014, where we surveyed over 1,000 workers across the country and asked, do you experience sexual behavior in the workplace that is scary or unwanted? And 90% of workers said yes. And so I just want to point out, for all of our work on these issues and the surveys and the interviews that we do, we are quite often wrong because we're asking the wrong question, because so many workers in this industry do not recognize what they're experiencing as sexual harassment. In their mind, the word sexual harassment connotes something so illegal, so extreme, that it cannot be what I'm experiencing. And because there is such a fine line between being asked to please the customer, do whatever it takes, the customer is always right, and experiencing something that is illegal. And in fact, what workers experience on a daily basis, what they reported to us in these 1,000 surveys, is that on a daily basis, they are told by managers. We heard this from the majority of workers we surveyed. I encourage you to go out, dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing. That's how you're going to make more money in tips. That's how you're going to do well on this job, is by going out, basically exposing more skin, allowing yourself to be harassed. That is how you're going to make more money in tips. Later on, we worked with Professor Catherine McKinnon, who many of you may know is the legendary law professor who actually coined the term sexual harassment and fought all the way to Supreme Court to make it illegal. She worked with us on a series of reports and said, after working with us, that she has never seen another industry in any sector with a higher rate of sexual harassment than tipped workers, including the military. She also said she has never seen a policy more effective at cutting sexual harassment than just paying these women an actual wage so they don't have to rely on the biases and flirtation and harassment of customers to feed their children. Because here's the thing. We actually did this survey across the country. I told you there are 43 states that allow a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. There are 7 states that never allowed this: California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska. All require full minimum wage with tips on top. And despite what the other NRA has argued for literally 100 years, these 7 states have higher restaurant sales per capita than the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage, higher job growth in the restaurant industry, higher small business growth rates than the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage. Even the chains, which lead the National Restaurant Association, are growing faster in the 7 states with a full minimum wage with tips on top. Last year, when we were working with Congress members to move this at the federal level, raise the minimum wage to 15 and the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, at that time, the NRA was arguing forcefully that paying a $15 wage would make them go out of business. Newsweek exposed in the same moment the CFO of Denny's was caught telling shareholders on an analyst call, in fact, paying 15 plus tips in California has resulted in Denny's growing faster in California than any state in the US. Why? Because we pay our workers more, and therefore consumer spending is higher, and therefore we've grown faster. Because guess who eats out in Denny's? It's working people. It's restaurant workers who are able to take their families to go eat in Denny's in California and completely unable to do that here in Maryland, where they're paid $3.53, and where, by the way, the prices in Denny's are exactly the same as they are in California. And so when we looked at these 7 states versus the 43 states, we found that when we did this 1,000-person survey, workers reported 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment, 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment. Why? Because the workers in California and the 7 states reported that they are not entirely dependent on the tips. They get tips. In fact, tipping is higher in those states than it is in the 43 states, but they're not entirely dependent on the tips to feed their children. If a customer comes and tries to harass them or say something to them, they say buzz off, because they can count on a wage from their boss like every other worker in every other industry. We worked with a Congress member who did a Server for an Hour event a couple of years ago, and she was a tipped worker. You might know her. Her name is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She did an event with us a few years ago, and she said, look, it's like this. When you work in a state with a sub-minimum wage, maybe until the 15th of the month, somebody might grab you or try to touch you, and you can say buzz off. From the 15th to the 31st of the month, you know you need those tips to pay your rent and your bills on the 1st of the next month. And so you are going to allow the person to do whatever they want to you. She later revealed, when the Dobbs decision came down, that while she was working at the restaurant, she was raped. This is the level of harassment the workers and assault the workers in our industry face on a daily basis. I remember speaking to an audience like this. It just reminded me. And a woman got up and said, I remember working in the restaurant as a young person, because 1 in 2 Americans starts. How many of you ever worked in a restaurant? Just look around the room. 1 in 2 Americans starts their work life in restaurants, in high school, college, graduate school. Woman got up in an audience like this and said, I remember working as a server. I was being harassed on the job, complained about it. The manager took me into the walk-in freezer, raped me, and then I had to go out and finish my shift. And the reason this happens is because when women, young women, all women in this industry are basically told, your job is to subject yourself to objectification in order to do well on this job, in order to make more money in tips. When that is your job and that is how you do well, then you are fair game to pretty much everybody in the restaurant, the managers, the cooks, everybody. And when the back of the house doesn't learn tips, but you do, the back house meaning the kitchen, and they know you rely on tips, but they don't. You rely on pleasing the customer, but they don't necessarily. I had also women say, I was asked by the kitchen that if you wanted the meal made just as the customer wants it so you can get your tip, show me your breasts or give me a kiss. Do what I need. And, in order for you to be able to get what you need to please the customer to get your tip. Because for tipped workers who are overwhelmingly women, their income is entirely dependent on whether they please the customer. Everybody knows that. Everybody in the restaurant knows that. And that is what became so unlivable with the pandemic. So even pre-pandemic, we had the highest rates of poverty and sexual harassment of any industry. Even pre-pandemic, we were fighting this issue. Every time we put this issue on the ballot anywhere, for all the issues you're talking about this week, I want to tell you, most of the American public believes they need to go. It doesn't matter their politics. We've pulled this and put this on the ballot in red states and blue states. It doesn't matter. Most Americans agree when you work, you should be treated well. You should have a healthy and safe workplace. You should be paid a livable wage. Most Americans agree, which is why, frankly, when you put minimum wages on the ballot, it has never failed in the history of the United States in red and blue states. So pre-pandemic, we put this issue on the ballot in DC, we won. We put it on the ballot in Maine, most popular ballot measure in the history of the state of Maine. Raised the signatures to put it on the ballot in Michigan. In each instance, we won. And the Restaurant Association, the other NRA, got legislators to overturn the will of the people, claiming voters were too dumb. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what they were voting for. So this has been a very tough fight. The Restaurant Association has put my children's pictures up on attack websites. They followed me around the country. They've gone after our funders and donors to their homes. I have been a vessel for attack for 20 years, but we are finally winning. Because yes, it was a hard fight and a horrific issue pre-pandemic. With the pandemic, workers, millions of workers for the first time since emancipation, this is why I'm saying it's a moment of historic revolt. For the first time since emancipation, millions of workers in this industry are saying, take your wage and your job and shove it. So with the pandemic, in March of 2020, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. 2/3 of the tipped workers who came to us, about 280,000 workers came to us. 2/3 of those workers reported that they actually couldn't get unemployment insurance because in most states, the 43 states, they were told your sub-minimum wage is actually too low to qualify for benefits. So in Michigan, I just want to give you the quick example of Michigan. We collected 400,000 signatures to raise the wage from the ridiculous $3.52 to $12 an hour. The Republicans who control the legislature knew that it would drive working people to the polls because it was so overwhelmingly popular. They took it off the ballot and made it the law, announcing to the press, we're doing this to keep the wrong people from voting, going to vote. They said that to the press. We promised to gut this after the election, and they did. They raised the wage from 3 to 12 to keep people from voting. After the election, they lowered it back down from 12 to 3. And 1 year later, those workers with the pandemic were told your wage of $3, sorry, it's too little to get unemployment insurance. I had a worker who was a mom in upstate Michigan, mother of an autistic child, working in a dive bar. She said, I religiously reported my tips to the IRS. When I went to apply for unemployment insurance, the state said, sorry, your employer never reported this. We have no record of you earning tips. Look like you earned $3, and that's too little to qualify for benefits because it looks like you didn't work enough to get unemployment insurance. We heard this from millions of workers. And in a cruel irony in the last year, there's been all this speculation. Why are they staying home? Is it because they're lazy collecting unemployment insurance? These folks never got unemployment insurance to begin with. And then they went back to work in the summer of 2020, and we kept surveying this group of 270,000 workers. So this is not a small sample size. 270,000 workers. The overwhelming majority of them told us when they went back to work in the summer of 2020, first of all, I don't want to go back to work. I don't feel safe. 1 in 3 told us somebody in the restaurant died of COVID. 1 in 3. The CDC named restaurants the most dangerous place for adults to be. During the pandemic, UCSF named restaurants the #1 most dangerous place to work above hospitals during the pandemic. Why? Because as opposed to the numerous masks and precautions taken in hospitals, restaurant workers were asked to work with people who had to take their masks off to eat and drink. 1 in 3 workers we surveyed said somebody in the restaurant died. They went back to work. Not only was it incredibly dangerous, but they said that an overwhelming majority, 60 to 70% of workers said tips went way down. They've been the lowest we've ever seen, and harassment went way up. On the notion of tips going down, the article in the New York Times today focuses a lot on the fact that tips have gone so down because sales are down that a majority of workers are now reporting tips don't even bring them to the minimum wage. So if you remember the history, the law was that we don't have to pay you because you get tips. The law says if tips don't bring you to the minimum wage, the employer has to pay the difference. Well, a majority of workers are now reporting tips don't bring me to the minimum wage. And under the Obama administration, we learned there's an 84% violation rate with regard to employers actually ensuring that they pay the difference if tips don't bring you to the full minimum wage. So tips went way down, not even enough to get them to the minimum wage. And a majority of women reported that harassment went way up. We already had the highest levels of harassment of any industry, but thousands of women reported to us and sent very graphic examples. I'm regularly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much to tip you. Take off your mask so I can see the pretty face of my server before I decide how much I want to tip. Take off your mask so I can stick my tongue down your throat. I have 7 pages of hundreds of comments women submitted that they've heard regularly. We heard this so regularly where we worked with Catherine McKinnon to document it. We ended up coming up with a new term for it. We call it masculine harassment because it was so prevalent and so many workers experienced it. But the real kind of breaking point was the point at which these workers were asked to enforce COVID protocols on the very same people from whom they had to get tips to survive. So in every other industry, you're talking about hazard pay, you're talking about, clapping, yay. This industry, they didn't even get the minimum wage, let alone hazard pay. They were in the most dangerous environment during COVID, and they were asked to do twice the work. They were asked to become public health marshals on top of serving and bartending. They were asked to tell people, sit 6 feet apart, wear a mask, let me see your vaccination card. At the minimum, a majority of workers reported that they were tipped less for enforcing these protocols. 70% of workers said, I'm tipped less for enforcing these protocols. By the way, it was much worse for Black workers. 85% of Black workers said, I'm tipped less. People weren't trying to hear from a Black server or bartender to follow the rules. They were tipped less at the minimum, but at the maximum, they were screamed at, they were yelled at, there were racial epithets. We had a member who was punched in the face for trying to enforce these rules, and another worker who was shot for trying to enforce these rules in upstate New York. And that was it. That was it. 1.2 million workers have left this industry. And of those who remain, more than 54% say they are leaving. And 80% say the only thing that would make them come back is a full livable wage with tips on top. So I know in this total health examination, you were thinking about a wide range of issues. Control and voice on the job, which is incredibly important. Health benefits, paid sick leave, family leave, childcare. I know you're looking at it all. I got to tell you, for the lowest wage workers, by definition, they're the lowest wage workers. The issue they tell us is the number one issue, 40 or 50 percentage points higher than every other issue, is their wage. And what I've tried to explain all this time is that the wage is central to pretty much every other issue. Health, harassment, treatment, dignity. And so if we don't deal with some of these core issues, you cannot be talking about all this, other stuff, which is so critical. I'm not trying to diminish it, but you can't get at the core of these workers' problems unless you're dealing with a very intentionally created wage. And so 1 million workers left. More than half of those who remain say they are leaving. 80% say it's due to the wage. And in response, the most miraculous thing has happened. Suddenly, after generations of saying, we'll go out of business if you make us pay a full minimum wage, we have tracked, and we got some funding to create this huge database, thousands of restaurants, literally over 5,000 independent restaurants we've tracked in Georgia and Alabama and Maryland, all over the country, now paying, used to pay 2 and 3, now paying 15, 20, 25 plus tips because it's the only way they can recruit staff. And I know you all are seeing the signs every time you eat out, help wanted, I'm sorry, I don't have enough staff, I can't serve you tonight, or you're just going to eat out and it's understaffed and the service is slow. We are facing the worst staffing crisis in the history of the United States. It is not a great resignation. It is a great revolution. And what workers themselves don't even know is that every time they walk out and say, I'm done, I can't handle it anymore, there's change that's following their leaving. Wages are going up. Restaurants in Dallas, Texas is a $2.13 state. Restaurants in Dallas are offering $25 an hour. In Massachusetts, the wage is $5. We're documenting restaurants in Cape Cod paying 50 plus tips. These are 1,000% wage increases. The things that the industry said they could never do, they are doing. The things that the industry said were impossible since emancipation are happening. And it is because finally of the power of workers actually engaged in what I would call, y'all can critique me, but what I would call a strike, a mass unorganized walkout of workers refusing to work for these wages and saying, I will only go back if wages go up. And as a result, this very, very tough fight we've been in for the last 20 years has totally radically changed. And it's why we're on the cover of the New York Times. So in July, something really incredible happened. I told you that in Michigan, in 2018, we collected 400,000 signatures to put this issue on the ballot. The Republicans took it off the ballot, made it the law, and then reversed it. In July, Michigan courts ruled that what they did was unconstitutional, and therefore, because of Republicans trying to suppress the vote, their law that they passed is now the law of Michigan, and the wage in Michigan is now $12 an hour plus tips. We just won this. It's the first state in 50 years to end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. It's historic in the state of Michigan, and it's only the first state. We are on the ballot this November, right here in Washington, D.C. We've been at this for 8 years in DC. The wage is going up this November from $5 to $16 an hour. And in Portland, Maine, we're on the ballot for $18 an hour plus tips. We're in a very historic moment where millions of workers for the first time in 160 years are rejecting this wage structure. Employers are responding, and the law is changing. We've got about a dozen states, including the state of Maryland, moving legislation in the new year to end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and raise wages overall. There is no other future. The industry will never have enough staff unless wages go up. And this is why I say the restaurant industry is the epitome for what is happening economy-wide. There is no future for American business or work unless wages go up. When your hourly wage is 1/2 the cost of a gallon of gas, let me say that again. When your hourly wage is 1/2 the cost of a gallon of gas, you are not going to work. I don't care how much they want to call you lazy. You are not going to go to work and pay double what you get when you get there. You're not going to do it. And this idea that somehow the economy is going to settle and we're going to be able to go back to normal, go back from 15 and 16 and 20 and 25 back to $3 next year is so ridiculous. And if you know anything about world history and economics and supply and demand, you cannot pay workers $25 this year and then tell them, I'm going to pay you $2, please stay with me next year. It's not going to work. And so there is an inevitable future here. It's not even a future, it's an inevitable present leading to an inevitable future. And it's why we decided this was a moment to go big. So this year, given this immense great resignation and the revolt and all the press we're getting, we announced a campaign called 25 by 250. We're moving bills and ballot measures in 25 states by the United States 250th anniversary, which is 2026. It's the 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which was signed in 1776. We believe it's time to declare independence from a numerous, long list of legacies of slavery, including this one. And so we are thinking big. We are going big because we are inspired by millions of workers. You've read about Starbucks and Amazon. That's amazing and inspiring. But there is so much more that is happening in the economy besides individual fights. There's this broad, very diffuse and organizable force of workers right now standing up and refusing to work for anything less than livable wages and dignified and healthy and safe working conditions. So my challenge and my question to you for your conference and in this week is that you cannot pretend that this moment is business as usual. You cannot act this week in thinking about total health like you should just do the same things you were doing before. Workers are not doing the same things they've ever done before. They are leaving. They're saying, I refuse to work unless I'm given X, Y, and Z. And so my question to all of us is, how are we thinking differently? How are we responding to this moment? How are we supporting millions of workers who are standing up and refusing to work for anything less than a healthy, safe, and dignified, livable working conditions in America? How are we responding to it? There is only one future, and it requires all of us to support these workers right now in their courageous stand against a very, very long history of intentional exploitation. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
reminding us and reminding us of these fundamental issues that have always existed and continue to exist. You know, we've spent the last day and a half talking about a lot of the future of work. And as you said, you know, how health and safety relates to discrimination and equity, diversity and inclusion, some of the most underserved. And what you just spoke of really does challenge us to think about how we can continue to really help shape and support some of the most fundamentals that we're trying to advance in the field of total worker health. So I want to reflect your question back to you and start by understanding your perspective and how you think the community of researchers, and also we have practitioners in the room, health and safety managers, HR managers, employers that are represented here today. What roles do each of us play in balancing what you just discussed around wages and around some of our topic issues in mental health, substance use, and safety?
Yeah, so I'm going to use myself as an example because I have been guilty of thinking too small. And that is what I am challenging you all to think about. Listen, I've been at this for a long time. And so I remember, I don't know if you remember, when the rallying cry around wages under the Obama administration was 10-10 and 70% for tipped workers. And that came from us. You know, we, for a long time after surveying workers, said, yes, $2.13 is too low, but didn't know the history and accepted the idea that tipped workers would always get less. And so we were like, let's get that percentage up. Let's get it to 70% for tipped workers. So I remember the rallying cry was 10-10 and 70% for tipped workers. And I had this moment of cognitive dissonance. I was on the stage with Nancy Pelosi. It was a big women's equity event. She was talking about, we've got to fight the fact that women earn 70 some cents to the man's dollar. And I was saying, yes, and we need to fight for 70% for tipped workers. And it was a recognition that this is ridiculous. We have been conditioned in some ways to ask for less, to do less, to think for less, to demand less. Workers have certainly been conditioned for that. But we also, as a community that thinks about workers, researches them, advocates for them, we also are guilty of this. And what this moment represents, and so we completely said, no, forget it. What we really need is to abolish this system, and we need 100%. We need a livable wage. That's why we're no longer even talking about 15. It's not enough to live on anywhere, let alone $2. So we had to think bigger, even pre-pandemic. But with the pandemic, what I'm trying to tell you is that the courage of millions of workers who had this awakening. Look, for so long, what the workers thought the worst thing that could happen to them in America, what American workers thought the worst thing that could happen to me is that I lose this job. Yes, this job sucks. I hate it that I'm paid $2 or $3. I hate that I have to show my breasts to get tips. I hate it that I have to put out in these ways to feed my kids. I don't like it. I don't feel safe. I don't feel dignified. But I put up with it because the worst thing that could happen is that I lose this job and then I'm out on the street. I can't pay my kid. I can't pay my rent and my bills. Well, the worst thing they could think of happened. It happened in March of 2020. And we started a relief fund for workers, unexpectedly raised like $24 million. 270,000 workers came to us for relief, and they were like wanting to talk. We organized these huge, immense virtual town halls with thousands of workers. And you could watch them going through this thought process of, wait a second, the worst thing I've been told that could ever happen to me happened. And now I don't ever want to go back to that unless I'm promised, guaranteed a livable wage and dignified working conditions. So the worst thing happened. The worst thing that the boss told me could ever happen happened, because for so long, what did restaurants tell workers? If you don't like it, leave. Workers did that. They finally did that. They left. And the employers are still saying they're lazy. What's wrong with them? Well, you told them if you don't like it, leave, and they did. They listened to you. They left. And so that courage, that awakening of, no, the worst thing is not to tolerate it, because the worst thing is I lose my job. The worst thing is to tolerate it. And so they're demanding more, and they're saying, I won't go back without this. And so I would ask you, if we've been thinking about incremental reform, if we've been thinking about 70% as opposed to 100%, if we've been thinking about small changes in the workplace, if we've been thinking about what we think is practical or possible with employers and politicians, I would ask you, at least as a thought exercise, throw that in the garbage that workers have for a moment. As a thought exercise, throw that incremental reform out and think about, no, what do we actually need and want? What do workers actually need and want? They need livable wages, which frankly, if you go to the MIT Living Wage Calculator, it's 18 and 25 in most parts of the country, including Mississippi, Alabama, West Virginia. And I encourage you to go to the MIT Living Wage Calculator if you've never looked at it. It is not, incremental reform has been good. It served its purpose. That is not the moment we're in. We're in a moment where workers are actually demanding more. And so I would ask you as researchers to think about what is it we actually dream of and need, because we might actually be able to win it right now. We are on the wage front. What about on the health front? What are those big things that we could think about if we didn't confine ourselves to what employers are willing to do, what's practical, what is possible right now is bigger than what's been practical for so long, and that's the different moment we're in.
Please give our speaker, Saru, another big thank you. We're going to hang on to